I never thought buying a stranger's groceries would be the thing that saved my life. But when the old man gripped my wrist in the checkout line at Piggly Wiggly and leaned close enough that I could smell coffee and wintergreen on his breath and whispered words I didn't understand until the next morning, everything changed. By the time I finally grasped what he was trying to tell me, I'd already come closer to losing everything than I ever want to admit. My name is Earl Dawson. I'm 66 years old. I own 42 acres of peach orchard outside Millbrook, Georgia, a piece of land my father planted by hand back in 1961 and left to me when he passed. The house sits on a small rise looking out over the rows of trees, and on a clear summer morning when the fruit is coming in and the air smells sweet all the way to the road, there is no better place on earth. Ruth always said that. She'd stand on the back porch with her coffee and breathe it in, like she was storing it somewhere inside herself for later. She passed 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, and I have not had a single morning since where I don't reach for her before I remember. I run the orchard alone now. People ask me why I don't sell, why I don't slow down, why a man my age is still climbing ladders in August heat. The honest answer is that this land is the last thing Ruth and I built together. Every tree on it has a year attached, a memory attached. I'm not ready to let that go, and I don't expect I ever will be. My son Travis is 37. He lives in Atlanta, 40 minutes south, works in commercial real estate, drives a truck that costs more than my father paid for this entire property. He's a good-looking young man, charming the way Ruth was charming. And for most of his life I was proud of him in the uncomplicated way fathers are proud. He called regularly. He came for holidays. He helped me when I had knee surgery 3 years ago, stayed a whole week without complaint. I tell you this so you understand that what came later didn't come from nowhere. Or maybe it did, and I just wasn't paying attention. It started on a Wednesday in late September. Travis drove up in the early afternoon, unannounced, which wasn't unusual. He came in through the back door the way he always had, accepted a glass of sweet tea, sat down at the kitchen table, and after a few minutes of talk about the orchard and the weather and nothing in particular, he said he needed to ask me something. There was an investment opportunity, he explained. A development deal. A piece of land outside Savannah that a group of investors was putting together. His firm was involved at the margins, but the real money was at the ownership level. He'd been following it for months, doing his research. It was solid, he said. The kind of deal that came along once in a career. He needed $40,000. I set my glass down slowly. Travis looked at me with those eyes that are so much like his mother's, open and earnest. And I felt the conflict that any parent would feel. $40,000 was not a small thing, but it wasn't beyond me either. The orchard had a good year. I had savings. I asked him the questions you're supposed to ask. Who else was investing? What the timeline looked like. What happened if the deal fell through? He had answers for all of them, smooth and practiced. And when he left that evening, he had my promise to think seriously about it. I didn't sleep well. Something I couldn't name kept pulling at the back of my mind. The next afternoon, I drove into town for supplies. Millbrook is the kind of place where the same 3 families have owned the same 3 businesses for 50 years. And the Piggly Wiggly on Main Street is where everyone passes through eventually. I was waiting in the checkout line with a cart full of fertilizer supplies and a bag of coffee when I noticed the man in front of me. He was older than me by a decade or more, lean, with white hair cut close and a jacket that had faded from navy to something closer to gray. He was watching the cashier ring up his items with a focused attention, and when she told him the total, he opened his wallet, counted twice, and went still. I've seen that expression before. It's the particular stillness of a person doing hard arithmetic and arriving at a number they don't want to accept. He said something quietly to the cashier. She said something back. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's absorbing bad news he was halfway expecting. Before he could say anything else, I stepped up beside him and said it was no trouble, and I handed the cashier my card. The old man turned and looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were dark brown and very clear, the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to make small talk unnecessary. He said his name was Henry. He said he didn't accept charity. I told him it wasn't charity. It was just a Tuesday in Millbrook, and that seemed to satisfy something in him, because he let it go. I loaded my groceries into my truck and I was about to pull out of the parking lot when he appeared at my window. I rolled it down. He looked at me steadily. He asked if I was the man who owned the peach orchard out on Route 9, the one with the white farmhouse and the old water tower. I said I was. He nodded slowly. Then he said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since. "After your son leaves tonight," he said, "don't sweep the back steps. Whatever's there in the morning, leave it until someone else can see it." I stared at him. How did he know Travis was coming tonight? Travis hadn't called me again. As far as I knew, no one in Millbrook knew my son's schedule. "Henry," I asked. "What do you mean?" He just looked at me with those dark, clear eyes and said it again, quietly and precisely, the way a man repeats something he needs to make sure you've understood. "Don't sweep the back steps." Then he walked to a rusted Buick at the far end of the lot and drove away. I sat in my truck for a while thinking about it. I told myself the man was confused. Maybe he'd mixed me up with someone else. Maybe he was unwell, but the specificity of it stayed with me. Your son, tonight. Not a guess, not a generality. Something he knew. Travis did come that evening. He arrived around 7, again through the back door, and we sat on the porch and talked. He brought up the investment again. He had a folder this time. Printed pages with numbers and projections and a map of the Savannah property. He walked me through all of it with the patience of a man who had rehearsed. When he was done, he said the window for getting in was closing, and he needed an answer soon. I told him I was still thinking. He smiled, but something flickered behind the smile. Something quick and gone. Before he left, he asked if I wanted him to sweep off the back steps. There were leaves collecting there from the big pecan tree, he said. It'd take him 2 minutes. I felt something cold move through me. I told him no, that I'd get to it tomorrow. He looked at me for a beat longer than necessary, then said okay, hugged me goodbye, and drove away. I stood on the back porch a long time after his taillights disappeared. The night insects were loud. The air smelled like September in Georgia clay, and on the back steps, between the bottom tread and the railing post, I could see the pale scatter of pecan leaves that had been falling all week. I did not sweep them. I barely slept. By 5:30 I was up and at the back door, and what I saw on those steps in the early morning light made me put my hand against the doorframe to steady myself. Boot prints, 2 sets, both coming from the direction of the equipment shed at the back of the property, tracking across the steps and up to the back door itself. The prints were clear in the thin layer of pollen and leaf dust that had settled on the wood, the kind of natural record that a broom would have erased completely. One set was large, the stride long and confident. The other was smaller, more careful. They had come up to my door in the night. I followed the trail back across the yard, the equipment shed, where I kept my tools and a fireproof lockbox with copies of important documents, showed signs I might never have noticed if I hadn't been looking. A scuff on the door latch, where a tool had been applied to the lock. The padlock itself replaced and relocked, but the hasp sitting a 1/4 inch proud of where it normally sat, betraying that it had been removed and replaced in the dark. I opened the shed with my key. Everything appeared to be in order, but when I checked the lockbox, I found the documents had been disturbed, not taken, but handled. The order was wrong. The envelope containing my will, my property deed, and my financial account summaries had been opened and resealed, not perfectly. Someone had photographed them. I sat on the edge of the truck bed for a long time in the morning light, with my coffee growing cold in my hand, and I tried to think clearly. Someone came to my property in the night, broke into my shed, and photographed my financial documents. My son had been pushing me toward a $40,000 investment decision and had tried to sweep the back steps before he left. I drove into town that afternoon and went to see a man named Curtis Webb at Farmers State Bank, where my family had done business for 4 decades. I asked him to review my accounts for any unusual activity or any recent inquiries. Curtis is a careful man and a discreet one, and he had the look of someone choosing his words deliberately when he came back to the table. There had been an inquiry, he said. 3 weeks ago, someone had made a request for financial records and account summaries through what appeared to be a proper legal channel, a power of attorney document filed by an attorney's office in Atlanta. The name on the document was Travis Earl Whitfield. My legal name. Not the name anyone calls me. I asked Curtis whether he had released those records. He said he had, because the documentation appeared to be in order. He said he was sorry, and I could see that he meant it. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, and a feeling in my chest like swallowing gravel. I pulled every document I had, compared signatures, found what I was afraid I'd find. Someone had copied my signature from an old check, blown it up, traced it onto a legal document, and filed a power of attorney with an Atlanta law firm giving Travis control over my financial affairs. It was dated 6 weeks ago, 3 weeks before he first came to me asking for $40,000. He wasn't asking for the money. He was laying groundwork, testing whether I'd give it willingly. If I agreed, he could drain my savings with my blessing. If I refused, the power of attorney was already in place. That night I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with Ruth's photograph on the shelf above the stove and tried to understand how we had arrived here. Not this moment, but this version of our son. When had the man who stayed a week after my knee surgery become the man who stood in my shed in the dark photographing my will? I thought about what I knew and what I didn't. I thought about Henry in the Piggly Wiggly parking lot and the certainty in his voice. After your son leaves tonight. He had known Travis was coming. He had known about the steps. He had known something was going to happen, which meant he had known something was being planned. I called my neighbor Darlene the next morning. She lives half a mile down the road and has a security camera at her gate that her son installed after a string of mail thefts the previous spring. I asked if I could come look at the footage from 2 nights ago. She said of course, and had coffee ready when I arrived. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was enough. At 11:47, a black sedan drove slowly past her gate with its headlights dimmed, moving toward my property. At 1:20, it passed again, going the other direction. Faster, 2 figures in the front seats. As the car turned at the intersection, a streetlight caught the driver's side and showed a partial view of the passenger. A younger man holding something flat across his lap. A folder, or a tablet displaying photographs. I copied the footage to a flash drive Darlene gave me. That afternoon I drove to the county seat and sat down with a friend of mine, a retired sheriff's deputy named Bill Okafor, who'd worked this county for 22 years before bad knees made him step down. I laid everything out on his kitchen table. The boot prints, the disturbed lockbox, Curtis's account at the bank, the forged power of attorney, the security footage. Bill listened without interrupting, which is the kind of listener he's always been. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Earl, you understand what you're looking at." I said I did. He said, "The forgery alone was a felony." The sheriff's investigators showed up with questions about notarized documents bearing forged signatures. Greg Connor, it turned out, had been Travis's college roommate. He had helped arrange the forged power of attorney in exchange for a fee, and he had also been the second man in that black sedan. The folder Travis's passenger had been holding contained photographs of my documents. Connor had come along to verify which accounts were worth targeting. What neither of them had anticipated was that I would be awake, that I would not sweep the steps. The investigation moved quickly. Sheriff Pruitt called me on a Friday morning, 10 days after I'd first walked into Bill's kitchen, and told me they had enough to bring charges. She asked me how I wanted to handle the arrest. I asked her to let me speak with Travis first. He came on Saturday afternoon. I'd called and asked him to come by, told him I'd made a decision about the investment. He came through the back door, smiling, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder of my own. I slid the forged power of attorney across to him. He looked at it for a long moment. Something moved across his face, calculation giving way to something more complicated. I don't have the heart to recount all of it word for word. What I'll tell you is that he didn't deny it for long. What came out over the next half hour was the shape of a debt I hadn't known existed. Travis had been gambling for 2 years, sports betting that started as recreation and became something else entirely. He owed close to $90,000 to people who were, as he put it, not patient men. He'd borrowed from Greg Connor's network, from other sources, from every direction he could think of before he arrived at the conclusion that my orchard was worth over $600,000, and I was 66 years old and living alone. He said it in a tone that was almost clinical, the way you'd describe a market condition rather than your father. He said the plan was to gradually take over my financial management, have me declared cognitively impaired by a doctor Greg knew, sell the property in my name before anyone could contest it, and pay the debts. He said he never intended for me to be hurt. I sat with that for a moment. I told him that a man who steals his father's land intends exactly the harm he causes, regardless of what he tells himself. He had the grace to look ashamed. Not enough grace, but some. After he left, I called Sheriff Pruitt. She arrested Travis and Greg Connor the following Monday. If you're watching this right now, and you've been with me this far, I want you to drop the number 14 in the comments. Just that number, wherever you're watching from. It helps me know who stayed for the full story. The charges were filed, and the case moved toward trial. My attorney, a woman named Rosa Cardenas, who'd been recommended to me by Curtis at the bank, said the evidence was overwhelming. The forged power of attorney, the financial records, the security footage, Greg Connor's cooperation agreement with prosecutors. Travis entered a guilty plea 4 months later. But through all of it, one question never left me. Henry, the man in the parking lot. I went back to Piggly Wiggly twice looking for him and didn't find him. I described him to the cashier who had been there that day, a young woman named Beth, and she remembered him. He came in maybe once a month, she said. Paid cash most of the time. She had no name beyond what he'd told me himself. I drove out along Route 9 inches both directions one afternoon, looking for the rusted Buick. Found it parked in front of a small white house about 3 miles from mine, set back from the road with a mailbox that said H. Prior. Henry Pryor was sitting on his porch when I pulled in. He didn't look surprised. He invited me inside. His home was small and carefully kept, the kind of order a solitary person maintains because it gives structure to quiet days. On the walls were photographs spanning decades, a family through time. I noticed that the photographs of a younger man stopped abruptly at what looked like his early 30s, a gap where the story should have continued. I told him what had happened. I thanked him. I asked him how he had known. He was quiet for a long time, both hands around his coffee mug. Then he began to talk. His son, he said, had worked at a law firm in Atlanta for several years. Not Greg Connor's firm, but connected to it through a network of people who, as Henry put it, helped each other with difficult transactions. His son, Nathaniel, had been involved in similar arrangements before, had called Henry drunk one night years ago and described a job he'd helped with. A signature here, a document there, nothing that would stick to him. Henry had tried to talk Nathaniel out of that life and failed. The same failure in different clothing, year after year. 3 weeks before we met in the parking lot, Nathaniel had called again. Drunk, loose, and proud of himself. He mentioned a job in Millbrook, an orchard, an old widower whose son needed liquid capital. He'd mentioned my name. Henry had looked me up, driven past my property, and when he saw me in the Piggly Wiggly checkout line, he recognized my face from a photograph he'd found in an old church directory. Because he had seen that face before, he got up and brought a photograph from a drawer. It was a picture from a hospice facility, a group of volunteers in the family room, taken sometime in the last decade. In the second row, clearly visible, was Ruth. My Ruth, wearing the blue cardigan she always wore when she was doing something she cared about. Standing beside her, holding the same side of a quilt they were apparently refolding together, was a woman I didn't recognize. Henry touched the photograph gently. "That's my wife, Dorothea," he said. "She volunteered at Mercy Hospice for 12 years. She and your wife were close. They worked together every Thursday for almost 3 years." I didn't have words for a moment. He said Dorothea passed 2 years before Ruth did. Same facility, different floor. He said when Ruth was admitted, Dorothea wasn't there anymore to sit with her, and that had weighed on him since. The idea that Ruth had gone to that place, and his wife hadn't been there to hold her hand the way she always had for others. When he saw me in that checkout line, he said, it was like being handed a chance to repay something he had no other way to repay. I sat in Henry Pryor's small living room with the photographs on the wall and the Georgia afternoon going golden outside the windows, and I thought about the invisible threads that connect people, the ones you never see, until they pull taut and save you. He had risked his relationship with his own son to protect me. He had made the call to Bill Okafor's connection at the sheriff's department, anonymously, with specific enough information to prompt the investigation that ultimately built the case. He had warned me about the steps because he knew the night visit was coming, and he knew evidence would be left, and he knew that the only thing standing between me and losing everything was a few weeks of leaves and pollen on a wooden dep. I asked him what had happened with Nathaniel. He looked at the window for a moment. "He's in federal custody," he said. "Unrelated charges that came out of the Connor investigation. He's going to be away for a long time." He said it without breaking, the way a man says something he has had a long time to prepare for. I went home that evening and sat on the back porch until the sun went all the way down. I watched the peach trees go from gold to gray to black outlines against a darker sky, and I talked to Ruth the way I do sometimes when the evening gets quiet enough. I told her about Henry and Dorothea. I told her I thought she would have liked knowing about this, that she would have found it exactly like her to be involved in something this important, even from a distance, even after. Travis was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of reduction for good behavior and cooperation. Greg Connor received 18 months in disbarment. Nathaniel Pryor's separate charges carried a longer sentence. I visited Travis once, about 6 weeks after sentencing. He looked thin and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the facility, and everything to do with what a person looks like when they have fully understood what they did. He apologized. It was a real apology, without conditions, and I received it the same way. I told him what his mother used to say about the difference between a mistake and a choice. A mistake is something that happens to you. A choice is something you make. This had been a choice, at every step, and the work of his life from here was to understand why he had made it and to become someone who wouldn't make it again. I told him I would keep that door open. I haven't been back since. Maybe someday. Henry Pryor and I have dinner on Tuesdays now. Sometimes he comes to the orchard. Sometimes I go to his place. We talk about Dorothea and Ruth, about the orchard, and the particular way Georgia light falls in October, about Nathaniel and Travis, and what it means to love a child who has made themselves into someone you don't recognize. We talk about that more than anything else, I think. It is the conversation neither of us can fully finish, but we keep at it anyway. Two old men, working on something that doesn't have a clean answer. I had my will updated. The orchard is going to a land trust that will maintain it as working farmland for the county in perpetuity. There is a scholarship fund in Ruth's name at the County Agricultural College for students studying sustainable farming. I endowed it with the money I would have given Travis for his investment, plus some. There is also a small fund in Dorothea Pryor's name at Mercy Hospice, designated for volunteer coordination. Henry cried when I told him. It was the first time I'd seen him show anything other than that careful steadiness. We sat with it for a minute, before he poured more coffee and asked about the orchard's late crop, and we were back to normal. This is what I want to leave with anyone who has listened this far. My son never told me he was in trouble. $90,000 in gambling debt, creditors threatening him, a life coming apart at the seams, and not a single word to the man who would have done anything in his power to help. Pride is not a virtue when it destroys the only people who would have stood by you without conditions. If Travis had come to me honestly, sat at this same table and laid it out, I would have emptied my savings, sold equipment, done whatever it took, because that is what a father does. Instead, he chose silence and then deception, and what he lost in the process cannot be calculated in money. The second thing is this. Trust is not built by asking. It is built by showing up, year after year, in the ordinary moments when nothing is at stake. Henry Pryor never asked me to trust him. He just showed up in a parking lot on a Tuesday and told me something true at a cost to himself. That is the whole of it. And the last thing, I have walked this orchard alone for 4 years since Ruth died, and I have been lonelier than I knew how to say. What surprised me, in the aftermath of all this, was that the loneliness changed, not because the grief changed, but because I understood that I had never actually been without the people who cared about me. They had been there the whole time. Darlene with her coffee and her camera. Curtis at the bank choosing his words carefully because he respected me. Bill Okafor clearing his kitchen table on an afternoon's notice. Henry Pryor standing at my truck window with something important to say. We are not as alone as we convince ourselves we are in the dark hours. That is not nothing. In fact, it might be everything. If this story moved you in any way, please leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It means more than you know to hear from the people on the other side of this. Hit the like button if you stayed until the end, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for giving an old man your time. May you know tonight that you are not as alone as you think you are.